My name is Laura Sutton, and I'm 42 years old. A year ago, I stood beside my mother's open grave while my husband's voice came through the speaker of my phone, ordering me to leave her funeral. Put me before your mother. Come to my family's gathering in an hour. 40 people heard it. The pastor heard it. My dad heard it. And my dad is not a man who shakes. But his hands started trembling over my mother's casket, and he said something so quietly I almost missed it. Let's give him what he wants. What we did 3 hours later at my mother-in-law's dinner table is something this town still talks about. And that was only the beginning. Because my husband thought he knew exactly who he'd been married to for 21 years. He was about to discover he'd never met her at all. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where women who kept the peace for decades finally tell you what that peace cost them. Grab your coffee and settle in, because this story starts in a cemetery and ends with an apron I only wear when I choose to. Drop a 1 in the comments telling me where you're listening from, and be sure to subscribe. Let me take you back to that Saturday morning. I buried my mother the way I'd done everything for 21 years. Alone with a clipboard. I ordered the casket spray. I printed the programs. I set up 90 folding chairs in the church hall for the reception because the funeral home only provided 60. I loaded my mother's favorite hymns onto my phone because she'd asked me near the end to play them at the graveside from the little speaker she kept on her porch. My husband, John, helped with none of it. John was across town at his mother's house, stringing patio lights for the sudden summer gathering, the annual party his family had thrown on that same Saturday for 30 years. He saw no reason a funeral should move it. The night before, while I ironed my black dress, he'd stood in the bedroom doorway with a beer and delivered his position like a manager reading a memo. Funerals are for the living, Laura. And the living I answer to are at my mother's. I remember thinking I should write that one down because someday I'd want to remember the exact moment the last light went out. At 9 that morning, the funeral director asked me gently whether Mr. Sutton would be riding in the family car. I said, Mr. Sutton was detained. The man had been burying this town's mothers for 30 years. He knew what detained meant. He simply nodded and closed the door, and we rode to the church, past the hardware store and the flower shop, while I stared the whole way at the empty seat beside me. Within the hour, that empty seat would follow me to the front pew in front of everyone my mother had ever loved. To explain what happened at that grave, I have to show you a hook on a pantry door. My mother-in-law, Dolores, keeps 3 brass hooks beside her kitchen pantry. The first holds her apron. The second holds her late husband's barbecue mitts, untouched since he passed. The third, for 21 years, held mine. Nobody assigned it to me out loud. I was 19 when John first brought me to a Sunday dinner, and somewhere between the casserole and the pie, his mother handed me a dish towel, and that was that. I'd been an accountant once, spending 3 years at Herrick & Lowe in Corvalet handling reconciliations, payroll and audits, and I was good at it. When Emma was born in 2006, John and his mother agreed, without consulting me, that Sutton wives didn't do other people's books. I gave my notice in 2007 and cried in the parking lot where no one could see. But here's the thing about women like me. We keep the skill even when they take the title. For 19 years, I did the books quietly at home for the florist, the lumberyard, and Dr. Pratt's dental office. Every check went into the joint account John managed, and John reviewed that account the way a warden reviews mail. In 2014, I opened a small business checking account in my own name for client invoices. I told him, and he waved it off because money that small was beneath his attention. Every night, in a green cloth ledger I'd kept since my first job, I wrote it all down. Every deposit, every withdrawal, every dollar that went out wearing his name. Numbers were the one thing in that house that never lied to me. Remember that ledger. It matters later. More than anyone at that party could have guessed. My mother fought colon cancer for 14 months, and I was there for almost all of them. I drove her to treatment. I kept the prescriptions filled and the appointment calendar straight because that's the shape my love takes. Lists, schedules, full plates. My dad, Frank, 70 years old and married to her for 46 of them, handled the impossible part. He sat with her and stayed cheerful until he got to the truck. Then he would close the door, put both hands on the steering wheel, and let himself brake for exactly 5 minutes before coming back inside. That was my father. He could carry grief without making anyone else carry it for him. John was different. He measured grief by inconvenience, and that Saturday morning, he decided my mother's death was an inconvenience to his family's party. He gave me the cash envelope they kept for her medications because he said I was the one in the family who could make $1 behave. I logged that envelope in the green ledger like everything else, which is how there came to be one small entry in July 2025 that I wrote down and never mentioned. $4,000 taken by John for the initiation deposit at Cedar Glen Golf Club. He told me he'd put it back by Christmas. He told me his career required a membership and that my mother had more months than money. Anyway, I put my protest on the record and lost the way I always lost, quietly with the checkbook still balanced. What I remember most from those 14 months isn't the hospital smell or the wigs we laughed about. It's my mother on the back porch, thin as a sparrow, watching me carry her soup tray and saying the sentence she'd been saving her whole life. "You've set the table your whole life, baby. Someday, sit down at it." I told her I would. I meant it the way you mean things you've never once done. She died on a Tuesday in June. The sudden summer gathering was set for Saturday. Those two dates were about to collide, and only one man in town couldn't see it coming. The church was full by 10 o'clock. My mother had spent 30 years running the hospital laundry and 40 years running the quilting circle, and both shifts showed up. My dad stood at the door in his one good suit, shaking hands like an oak tree that had gone hollow, still standing, nothing left inside but the shape. Emma drove in from the university, 2 hours flat, and didn't let go of my hand through the whole service. She's 20, my girl, studying to be a teacher, and she kept scanning the doors for her father with an expression I recognized and hated. Bookkeeping. She was keeping his account. In the third pew sat Carol Weber, wife of Gordon Weber, who owns Weber Mechanical, the company where my husband had spent 11 years climbing toward the general manager job. Carol had quilted beside my mother every Thursday for a decade. Remember her too. Near the back, a silver-haired man I hadn't seen in 19 years quietly carried in extra folding chairs when the ushers ran short. James Holt. We'd worked audits together at Herrick and Low back when I was Laura Putnam. His mother was in the quilting circle. He caught my eye, nodded once, the way you do at funerals, and that was all. My phone buzzed during the second hymn. A text from John. Running behind. Traffic. During the eulogy it buzzed again. Wrap it up by 2. Gatherings at 4. I stood up after that and spoke about my mother's hands. And my voice held until the very last line. I watched half the church break with me. Then we drove to the cemetery, 40 of us, under a sky so blue it felt hired for the occasion. And in my purse, my phone sat like a small black landmine. Graveside was the small crowd, the real one. 40 people who had known my mother by her first name. My dad and I stood at the head of the grave, Emma between us, and I did the last thing on my mother's list. She'd asked for her hymns at the lowering. Not an organ, she'd said, just the porch speaker like a Sunday morning at home. So I set her little speaker on the folding table by the flowers, paired my phone to it the way I'd done 100 times on that porch, and pressed play. In the garden, rose up over the grass, tinny and sweet and completely her. People closed their eyes. My dad's chin came up the way it does when he's holding a load. The pastor said the words about dust, and 2 men in work gloves began to lower my mother into the ground. The roses went down one at a time, each with somebody's whole face behind it. Emma dropped hers and whispered something I'll keep private. I was reaching for my own rose when the music cut out. For half a second there was pure silence, just birds and the ropes creaking. Then the speaker, my mother's speaker, made the bright little chirp it makes when a call comes through the phone it's paired to. The screen in my hand lit up with his name. Every reflex I owned said, "Silence it." And my thumb, clumsy with grief, hit the wrong part of the glass. I answered him on my mother's porch speaker, at the edge of my mother's open grave, turned up loud enough to reach the back row of mourners. My husband cleared his throat. "Where are you?" His voice rolled out over the grave like a truck driving through a chapel. Loud, irritated, echoing slightly off the headstones. I told you the gathering starts at 4. The Webbers are coming. I need my wife here. Not standing around a cemetery all afternoon. I couldn't move. 40 faces turned toward the little speaker among the funeral roses, and my husband's voice kept coming, each word laid down clean and public like coins on a counter. For once in your life, put me before your mother. Come to my family gathering in an hour. The ropes had stopped creaking. The men in work gloves stood frozen, holding my mother halfway into the earth. I heard a shovel shift in the dirt pile. I heard someone's breath catch. I think it was the pastor. Carol Weber turned her face away, her shoulders rigid, and I understood with a strange floating clarity that she would remember this sound for the rest of her life, and so would every other person standing on that grass. My mother had worked in the hospital laundry for 30 years. She used to say, "You can tell everything about a man by what he does when he thinks no one important is watching." John thought no one important was listening. He was on speaker in front of everyone who had ever loved me. I looked down at the phone in my hand. I did not scream and I did not explain because there is a kind of tired that arrives past anger, and it is very, very calm. "I heard you, John," I said and ended the call. The hymn came back on, soft and oblivious, right in the middle of the verse about walking and talking in the garden. Nobody moved. Then I saw my father's hands, and that is when this story truly begins. My father is a retired machinist. 41 years at the same shop, micrometers and lathes. A man who measures twice and speaks once. I'd seen him angry maybe 3 times in my life, and every time it looked like this. Total stillness except for the hands. His hands were shaking like a man holding a live wire. He looked into the grave at the casket holding the woman he'd loved since 1980, and he was quiet so long that the pastor started to say something merciful. Then my dad lifted his head and looked at me, and his voice came out level, even, and terribly gentle. "Let's give him what he wants." The pastor blinked. Emma said, "Grandpa," furious tears still on her face. I said, "Dad." He took the phone out of my hand, careful with it, like it was a part from a machine that had failed inspection, and handed it to Emma. "He wants his wife at that party," my dad said. "Then that's what he'll get." Exactly that. He straightened his suit jacket, nodded once to the pastor, and picked up the rose I'd dropped. He laid it on my mother's casket himself. Then he said the strangest thing anyone has ever said to me at a funeral. "Trust me, Laura, and wear the apron." I stood there between my mother's grave and my father's shaking hands, and I felt something shift in my chest. A lock or a gear, something that had been stuck for 21 years moving one tooth over. 40 people watched us walk to the car. None of them knew what my father was planning. To be honest, neither did I. But I got in and gave him the only answer I had left. "Okay." We buried my mother first. All of it. The last hymn, the handshakes, the casseroles loaded into trunks at the church hall. John's 1-hour deadline came and went while I hugged 40 people goodbye, and I did not hurry. It was past 4 when we finally drove the 20 minutes to Dolores's house in our funeral clothes. All 3 of us, my dad at the wheel of his Buick, his jaw set like a sundae, and Emma leaning forward from the back seat. "Grandpa, if you're about to fight him." "Nobody's fighting anybody," my dad said. "Your grandmother didn't raise brawlers." He glanced at me sideways, and there it was, faint but alive, the dry little spark my mother had married him for. "Laura, 21 years. That man's treated you like staff. Today, he ordered the staff to report to the party. He let that sit. So we're not going to fight him, sweetheart. We're going to resign." I looked out the window at the town going by. The pharmacy, the ball field, the church where I'd been married at 21. And I understood that something was ending. Not my marriage yet. Not that day. But the version of me who had spent 21 years believing that keeping the peace meant keeping everyone else happy. My father's words followed me all the way to Dolores's driveway. "We're going to resign." And for the first time I wondered what my life might look like if I stopped being the woman everyone expected me to be. I understood the whole shape of it at once, and my heart started pounding in a way that had nothing to do with fear. He was offering me the door, but how I walked through it, that part belonged to me, and I already knew exactly how I would do it. No screaming. No scene he could retell later as proof that I was hysterical. John wanted a wife who served. He would get a full shift, executed to the letter, flawless down to the last fork, and then he would learn what every employer eventually learns. The ones who never complain are often the ones who are already gone. One condition, I said. Nobody says a word in there unless I do. My dad nodded like we'd just shaken hands on a contract. Emma looked back and forth between us, half terrified and half something else. I'd say proud. We pulled up to the curb behind 15 parked cars. Laughter floated over the fence with the smell of brisket. My hands were steady. I want that on the record. My hands were steady. 30-some guests and neighbors filled the backyard, dressed in sundresses, seersucker, pastel everything. And then the three of us came through the gate in black, like a bill arriving at a birthday party. The conversation dipped. John saw me from the drink table, and his face did a thing I'd watched for 2 decades. A flash of panic that disappeared in half a second, plastered over with a salesman's smile. "There she is," he called out, arms wide. "She made it, everybody." A few people clapped uncertainly, the way you clap when you can't tell whether you're at a celebration or a hearing. Dolores appeared on the porch steps in her hostess apron, took in my funeral dress, my father, my daughter, and didn't blink. 71 years old, and not one blink. "Well," she said, "you're late, dear. The trays won't carry themselves." And there it was, the whole marriage, the whole family, delivered in one sentence at room temperature. I walked past her into the kitchen I knew better than my own, took my apron from the third hook, and tied it over my funeral dress. "Last time," I whispered to the hook. Then I worked. Deviled eggs went out to the long table. Brisket was sliced and fanned across the good platter. Iced tea was refilled, lemon wedge included, no seeds. I moved through that party in dead silence, precise as payroll, my black dress underneath the gingham like a signature beneath a contract, and I never once smiled. My dad and Emma did exactly what we'd agreed. They sat in 2 chairs dead center, guests of honor at their own occupation, hands folded, touching nothing, watching me serve. It took the yard about 20 minutes to feel it. Laughter kept starting and dying, and John began to sweat. By the time I brought out the peach cobbler, the party had gone quiet enough to hear the ice melt. 30 people pretended to chat while every eye tracked the woman in funeral black, moving through them with dessert plates, flawless and silent as a hearse. Dolores held court at the head of the long table, working hard at normal. John stood behind her chair with a beer he wasn't drinking, watching me the way you watch weather. I served the last plate. I set the coffee beside Dolores's cup, cream on the left, exactly the way she'd trained me in 2005. Then, in front of the entire Sutton family, I reached back and untied the apron. I folded it once, twice, into a neat gingham square and laid it on the table in front of my mother-in-law like a delivered parcel. "Laura," she said, her voice carrying a warning. I didn't answer. I was already working the wedding ring off my finger. 21 years. It left a groove like a lathe mark, and I placed it in the middle of the empty silver serving tray. It rang once, small and bright, against the crumbs of my last shift. Then I slid the tray down the table toward my husband. The whole yard heard it scrape. John stared at the ring, then at me. His mouth opened, and what came out was pure instinct, the truest thing he'd ever said. "You don't get to quit on this family." I looked at him at the drink table, at the lights he'd strung while I printed funeral programs, at the mother watching me with her spine straight as rebar, and I felt 21 years close behind me like water over a stone. "You can't fire me, John. I don't work here anymore." Then I walked. My dad rose, and this is the part the town still tells. He pushed his chair in neatly, machinist to the end. Emma grabbed my purse. The gate clicked shut behind us, soft as a decimal point. By the time we reached the car, my phone had started buzzing, and it didn't stop for 3 days. I moved into my old bedroom at my dad's house that night with one suitcase and my mother's porch speaker. If you think the hard part was over, you've never left a man who owns all the keys. It took John exactly 2 days to remind me who had been holding the money. Monday afternoon at the pharmacy counter, I discovered just how expensive 21 years of obedience was about to become. Monday afternoon, while I was picking up my blood pressure refill, my debit card was declined. The girl at the register, a former student of Emma's grade, tried it 3 times out of kindness. Declined. Tuesday, the banking app wouldn't accept my password. Wednesday, John texted me that my car, the one I'd driven to chemotherapy for 14 months, titled in his name like everything else, needed to come back for maintenance. He had already put himself before everything else. Now it was official. I stood in my dad's kitchen with a dead card, no car, and a suitcase full of funeral clothes. And I want to be honest with you about that hour because somebody listening needs to hear it. I wobbled. It's one thing to lay a wedding ring on a serving tray with your chin up. It's another to be 42 years old and suddenly locked out of your own life by a man who's very good at looking reasonable in front of tellers, pastors, and judges. Then I remembered the one account John had never bothered to sneer at. My little business checking account, where invoices from the florist, the lumberyard, and Dr. Pratt's dental office had been deposited faithfully since 2014. The balance was $3,900. Not much compared with a man who had the house, the cars, and 11 years at Weber Mechanical, but it was mine in my name and out of his reach. And let me tell you what that kind of money is really worth. If you've ever stood at a register with a card you already knew would decline because someone else decided what you deserved that week, tell me about it in the comments. I read them, and so do thousands of women who once thought they were the only ones. And subscribe, because what John did next was something even his own mother couldn't defend. On Thursday, Emma video called me from her dorm, laptop light shining across her face, and repeated what she'd been saying since the graveside. "Mom, I'm with you all the way." 20 minutes after we hung up, her father called her. He was warm at first, she told me, the concerned dad voice he used for teachers and traffic cops. Then right before saying goodbye, he set the hook. "If your mother keeps up this little show, sweetheart, I may have to rethink some things. The college fund is in my name, Her voice was still shaking when she repeated it to me. That fund held 4 years of tuition we'd been saving since the day she was born. And he was right. Legally, it sat in his name with him as the owner. He hadn't threatened me. He'd priced me. That's what I mean when I say men like John don't lose their temper. They open negotiations. He had found the one thing I might crawl back for, and he placed it on the table with the safety off. So the next morning I did the most radical thing a woman like me could do. I hired my own advice. Patricia Reyes, a family law attorney one town over in Corvallis, had gray streaks in her hair, reading glasses on a chain, and a handshake like a door closing. Her retainer was $3,500. I paid it from my business account and watched 19 years of quiet invoices turn into a war chest. Patricia listened to the entire story without a single flicker of surprise, which told me she'd heard versions of it many times before. Then she removed her glasses and asked me the only question that mattered. "What do you have on paper?" For the first time since my mother died, I smiled. Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock, I drove my dad's Buick to 214 Maple Row. Patricia had reminded me that whatever John had done to the passwords, he'd be at Weber Mechanical until 6. I let myself in through the kitchen door and stood for a minute in the house where I'd raised my daughter. Smelled like his cologne and takeout. The counters, for the record, were filthy. The staff had resigned. I wasn't there for memories. I went straight to the bottom drawer by the stove, beneath the takeout menus and dead batteries. Exactly where it had lived for 2 decades because John never opened a drawer he couldn't spend from. The green cloth ledger. 21 years of our life were written there in my handwriting, month by month. Every deposit from my bookkeeping. Every mortgage payment. Every check to Emma's school. And one small entry from July 2025, the ink slightly heavier than the rest. $4,000 out of my mother's medication envelope. Initials. JIS. Destination, Cedar Glen Golf Club. Beside the ledger, I stacked the tax folders and the printout of the envelope tally I'd kept for my dad. My hands were quick and my heart was loud, and I was almost to the door when I heard tires in the driveway. Not the diesel growl of John's truck, but something lighter. I looked through the curtain and my stomach dropped an inch. Dolores's sedan had pulled in behind the Buick, blocking me neatly as a chess move. My mother-in-law had kept a key to our house since the week we closed on it. She'd insisted, and John had handed it over without even asking me. I heard the key turn in the front lock. I had the ledger in a grocery bag, one exit and maybe 30 seconds. So I did what I do best under pressure. I put the kettle on. Dolores stopped in the kitchen doorway and took inventory. Me, the kettle, and the grocery bag on the counter with a green spine showing. She's a smart woman. People miss that because she weaponizes doilies, but she reads a room like an auditor. You taking something? She asked. Collecting my paperwork, I said. Chamomile or nothing. That's what's left. We stood on opposite sides of that kitchen island like two countries with a long border, and she studied me. He won't forgive you, she said. The party. That little performance with the tray. Sudden men don't forgive public things. I know, I said. I'm not asking. Something moved behind her eyes. I'd call it respect if the word didn't embarrass us both. She looked at the ledger's spine, and I braced myself. Instead, she said quietly, almost like she was stating a fact about the weather. Every marriage runs on someone's back, dear. Mine ran on mine. Yours ran on yours. That's not cruelty. That's how a house stays standing. Then, even quieter, almost toward the window, she added, the day I buried my father, I had a roast on Harold's table by 6. Nobody asked me either. The kettle clicked off. Neither of us moved to pour. For one strange moment, I saw her clearly. Not Dolores, the mother-in-law, not the woman who had spent 21 years handing me an apron, but a 23-year-old girl in 1978, standing at a stove with an apron tied around her waist, grief folded away because the alternative had never once been offered. The same chain, one link older. Then the moment closed like a screen door. Take your book and go, she said. Took it. And here's the piece I didn't learn until much later. She never told John I'd been there. I've stopped trying to decide what that meant. Mercy has a quiet cousin, and its name is recognition. Here's something they don't teach you about small towns. News doesn't travel by phone. Travels by casserole. By the second week, everyone in Millbrook had heard about the graveside call. And I mean heard it in detail, right down to the echo. 40 mourners became 40 broadcasting stations. The checkout line at the market went quiet and kind when I walked up. At the ball field, 2 mothers I barely knew touched my shoulder like a church blessing. Ed at the barber shop, who had cut my dad's hair since Carter was president, reportedly refused to take John's usual appointment on account of being suddenly very busy forever. I want to be clear about what I was doing during all of this because it matters to how the story ends. Nothing. I gave no interviews at the bake sale. I corrected no details in the church parking lot. Patricia had advised silence, and silence suited me. But the truth was, I didn't need to say a word. That was the beautiful, terrible engine of the whole thing. There was only one version of the story, and it was his, in his own voice at full volume over my mother's grave. Put me before your mother. He had published his own confession to the exact 40 people a man who built his life on reputation could least afford to have listening. One of them sent my father a sympathy card that week. Cream paper, tidy blue ink. Carol Weber. My dad read it twice, then passed it across the breakfast table without saying a word. Beneath the printed condolences, she'd written one sentence. Ruth raised a lady. I keep that card in the ledger now, tucked into the July 2025 page like a pressed flower. That Friday, John called my dad's landline and asked very civilly if he could come over and talk like adults. My dad looked at me. Let him come, I said. He came Saturday morning wearing the good blazer and carrying flowers from the grocery store, performing concern across my father's porch rail. It was the grief and madness offer, and I'd known it was coming. I wasn't myself, he said. Losing your mother unbalanced you. Everyone understands. No one will hold it against you. Come home and we'll say no more about it. Then he opened his arms, as if the entire 21 years between us could be erased with one gesture. I forgive you, he said. Come home. I told him evenly that I was already home, and I watched the performance shut down like a fairground ride when the money runs out. The flowers dropped to his side. His voice dropped with them. You'll be broke in a month, he said. Look at you. You're a 42-year-old waitress with a calculator. You are nothing without me, and every person in this town knows it. The screen door opened behind me. My dad stepped outside with his coffee. 70 years old, calm as a Tuesday. He looked at John the way he used to look at a machine part that had failed inspection twice. Funny thing, my dad said. At the cemetery, I told her to give you what you want. She did. You wanted first place, son. You got it. He took a sip of coffee. Now you get to find out what first place looks like in an empty room. John left Rubber on the residential street pulling away. That evening, Dolores's sedan pulled up, and she handed me a still-warm casserole and an ultimatum in the same motion. Come home by Sunday, or you're nothing to this family. I gently placed the dish back into her hands. On Monday, a letter arrived from Bricker and Associates, the loudest divorce firm in the county. My husband had lawyered up. Good, Patricia said when I called her. Now pray he stays angry. Angry men sign things. While the lawyers circled, I did something for the first time in 19 years. I applied for a job under my own name. Herrick & Lowe, the Corvallis accounting firm where I'd started at 20, had a junior staff opening. The kind of position meant for somebody's granddaughter fresh out of school, not a 42-year-old woman with a 19-year gap on her resume and a funeral still fresh in her memory. The office manager gave me the standard skills test. 90 minutes of bank reconciliations and payroll scenarios. She seated me in a little glass conference room with a bottle of water and visible pity. I finished in 40 minutes. She checked my work twice, then went to get a partner. The partner asked carefully where I'd been working. A private household, I said. 21 years. No sick days. On my way out through the lobby, a silver-haired senior manager looked up from the copier, and 19 years fell off the calendar. James Holt. He didn't make it strange or soft. He simply said, Laura, you trained half this floor on reconciliations. Then he looked at the office manager, nodded as though the matter were settled, and went back to his copies. The call came the next morning. Junior staff accountant. $21 an hour. Start Monday. I sat in my dad's kitchen and stared at that offer letter for a long time. $21 an hour was less than I was worth. It was also more than I'd been paid in 19 years, which was nothing at all. A number I'd entered into the ledger every month. A zero with my whole life inside it. My dad read the letter, put it on the refrigerator under a magnet like a spelling test, and said, Putnam's work. Then he fried eggs badly. That part of the story comes next. Here's what starting over at 42 actually looked like for anyone keeping notes. Alarm at 5:45. Coffee with my dad in a kitchen that still had my mother's handwriting on the flour jar, then the 25-minute drive to Corvallis in the Buick. 2 months later, after my first paychecks were deposited into an account in my own name, I bought a gray Corolla for $2,800, 190,000 miles, paid in cash and titled to me alone. And I'm not ashamed to tell you that I sat in that dealership lot and pressed my forehead against that cheap steering wheel like it was an altar rail. At the office, I was the oldest junior accountant in the building, correcting spreadsheets created by juniors who had been in grade school the year I quit. I loved every hour of it. But the part of that summer I hold closest isn't the job. It's my father, 70 years old, deciding that if his daughter was going to work, somebody was going to feed her. The man had operated a lathe for 4 decades and couldn't crack an egg to save his life. He learned. He burned the first dozen. He swore at the pan in machinist language and kept at it like a man being paid by the yoke. And one morning in August, he set a plate in front of me, eggs, toast cut on the diagonal the way my mother used to make it, and said, "Sit down, Laurie. You've got 10 minutes. Eat while it's hot." I cried into those eggs. He pretended not to notice, which is the same thing as holding someone if you're from here. 21 years I had cooked for a man who never once made me a plate. It took my father one summer and a second-hand skillet to show me the difference between being needed and being loved. Meanwhile, across the county line, word began drifting out of Weber Mechanical through Emma's old babysitter, who worked the front desk. Gordon Weber was finally retiring, and the decision about his successor was, as everyone kept saying, under review. John found out where I worked, of course. In a county this size, he probably knew my parking spot before I did. On a Thursday in September, he was leaning against his truck beside my Corolla when I came out at 5, arms crossed, sunglasses resting on top of his head, the pose of a man who had rehearsed being casual. "So, this is the big new life," he said. He looked at the glass office behind me, then at my sensible shoes, and gave the little laugh he used to reserve for waiters. "I don't work here anymore," he said in a squeaky imitation of my voice. Cute line. Did your daddy write it for you? You think a spreadsheet job makes you somebody, Laura. And standing there in that parking lot, I realized he'd lost the one thing he'd always counted on, the woman who would manage his behavior for him. He'd say something shaped like a slap, and the old me would flinch, smooth it over, soften it, apologize for the weather if necessary. The new me had spent all afternoon doing payroll and wanted dinner. "It makes me payroll, John," I said, level as a spirit level. "That's more than you ever let me be." His jaw tightened. He stepped away from the truck, and his voice climbed into the same register the cemetery had heard. "You ungrateful, after everything? Do you have any idea what people are saying about me?" Behind me I heard the office door open. 2 junior accountants and the office manager were heading out for the evening, slowing on the sidewalk as they watched. John saw them, and I watched my husband suddenly see himself, a grown man shouting at a woman beside a used Corolla in broad daylight, 6 weeks before the Weber family would choose its next general manager. He got into his truck and drove away without another word. The next morning the mediation notice arrived. Thursday, 9 in the morning. Both parties in council. Patricia called me that night with one instruction: bring the book. Mediation took place in a beige conference room in Corvale with bad coffee and a mediator named Mr. Ellis, who had perfected the expression of a man surprised by nothing. John arrived in his good blazer with Bricker, who talked like a leaf blower. Their opening position came in a binder. John keeps the house. No spousal support. And if we didn't like it, they'd be delighted to spend 3 years litigating. Their phrase was, Mrs. Sutton's abandonment of the marital home. That's what they called a woman leaving a party where she'd been serving cobbler in funeral clothes. Patricia didn't argue. Arguing is for people without paperwork. She opened the green ledger to the tabbed pages and slid copies across the table one section at a time, calm as dealing solitaire. 19 years of household income from my bookkeeping, deposited into an account in his name. Every mortgage payment documented. Then she opened the July 2025 page and placed it beside the bank statement she'd subpoenaed to match it. $4,000 taken from a dying woman's medication envelope, initials JS, destination Cedar Glen Golf Club. Nobody shouted. That's the thing about arithmetic. It doesn't raise its voice. Simply sits there being true. John looked at that page, and his face went the color of the folder it came in. Bricker asked for a recess. And then came the moment I haven't told anyone until now. The lawyers stepped out. The mediator went for coffee. For the first time since the graveside, it was just John and me at a beige table. He stared at his hands. When he finally spoke, the salesman was gone. What was left sounded almost young. If you're not there, he said, who runs it? The house. Mom's Sundays. All of it. What am I supposed to be? For one breath, I saw the boy they'd built this man out of, and I almost pitied him. Then he straightened his cuffs and put the armor back on. Forget it. See you in court. Patricia drove me home. At the traffic light she looked over and said, He'll bleed you slowly now. Unless he suddenly needs something from you. She tapped the steering wheel. Pray he needs something. He needed something. Gordon Webber had scheduled his retirement gala for the third Saturday of October at the Hartwell Hotel in Corvallis. The whole county would be there. The entire county was invited, and the new general manager was going to be introduced from the podium that night. 60 years of Weber Mechanical were supposedly passing to their next steward, and you have to understand something about Weber Mechanical. They don't just sell heating and cooling. They sell trust. The kind of trust families place in the person who comes into their kitchen, checks the furnace, and leaves a van parked in their driveway. Gordon hired for character and promoted for character, and his wife had quilted beside my mother for 10 years. But my husband's character had recently introduced itself, in his own voice, to 40 witnesses standing beside a grave. John was bleeding credibility at the one company where credibility was the product. So the offer came first through Bricker, wrapped in lawyer language. My client proposes a comprehensive settlement contingent upon Mrs. Sutton's participation in certain family and professional obligations through October. Patricia read it twice and said a word I won't repeat. Then, close to midnight, my phone lit up. Not the cemetery voice, the other one. The voice from 23 years ago at the county fair. Soft and reasonable and warm as a heat lamp. One night, Laura. The gala. Come as my wife. Smile, wear the blue dress, stand beside me for 3 hours. And Monday morning I sign everything. House sold. We split it clean. Emma's fund locked up safely. All of it done by Christmas. One night and you're free. I sat on the edge of my childhood bed, listening to my husband negotiate for my presence the way he'd negotiate a fleet discount, and the strangest calm settled over me because at last, the entire marriage stood in the light where I could see its actual shape. It had never been a marriage. It was an appearance contract. My wages were the apron, and this was the renewal notice dressed up as a favor. I'll think about it, I said, then hung up and stared at the ceiling until dawn. Because here's the truth. It was a good deal. That's exactly what made it dangerous. Every sensible voice in my life told me to take it. Patricia went first because that's her job. If he contests this wall-to-wall, you're looking at $30,000 in legal fees, at least a year of your life, and no guarantees. 3 hours in a ballroom buys all of that back. I've watched women trade more for less. My dad came second and this one cost him. He stood drying dishes for a long time before finally saying, "Your mother wouldn't want you bleeding money for pride." Then he paused. Would she? The question mark told me he didn't believe his own sentence, but 70 years of practicality made him say it. Then Emma called Sunday night. Her voice small over the phone in a way it hadn't been since she was 8. Mom, it's one night. I've done the math on what that house is worth. I can't be the reason. I can't ask you to lose the house over one night. My girl was bookkeeping again, only this time she was putting herself in the debit column. I told her the house and the college fund were my worry and that her only job was getting through midterms. After we hung up, I sat alone in the dark, completely and utterly alone with the decision. And I understand now that this is where every real decision is made because they were all correct. That's what nobody tells you about moments like this. The wrong choice can arrive with excellent references. It was one night, 3 hours, one dress, one smile I'd manufactured 10,000 times before. Cheap at the price. Late that night, I opened the closet to hang my work blouse, and there it was, waiting behind the funeral dress. Navy blue, knee-length, the tags already removed. I'd bought it 2 weeks earlier, the day after John's midnight call. Some part of me, the part raised at a stove, the part that kept everyone fed and everything smooth, had already said yes. And that, more than John, more than Dolores, more than anything living or dead, was the enemy I'd been fighting my whole life. The night before the gala, I sat at my dad's kitchen table with 3 objects in front of me, like a woman laying out evidence for a jury of one. The green ledger, my mother's apron, taken from its kitchen hook in June and never unfolded, and Carol Weber's cream-colored card. I opened the ledger to the first page, September 2005. My handwriting at 21 was careful, round, and eager to get our brand new life exactly right. Groceries, rent. Then one line stopped me. Gift Dolores. Serving tray. And the price. Because even then, even during the honeymoon, I was already accounting for that family's silver. 21 years of pages separated that girl from me. She had thought the ledger was a love letter, that keeping everything balanced was the same thing as keeping everyone safe. Every page after that proved something different, and I had never once allowed myself to read the evidence. My mother's voice came back to me then, not mystically, just remembered, porch warm and steady. You've set the table your whole life, baby. Someday, sit down. And sitting there, I finally did the one piece of math nobody had ever asked me to do. The house was worth a number. The legal war was worth a number. But one night had been the price of admission my entire life. One night is just Sunday dinner. One night is just the family gathering. One night is just the fundraiser, the client barbecue, the Christmas party. String enough one nights together and you get 21 years. And a woman standing beside her mother's grave, holding a phone while her husband orders her to report to work. The dress wasn't a dress. It was the apron with a zipper. Here's where I'm supposed to tell you I burned it in the yard. The truth is stranger. The gala started at 7. At 6:15, I put on the navy dress, my earrings and my good coat. My father watched me pick up the car keys and, God bless that man, he never said a word. I drove toward Corville in the navy dress, hands steady at 10 and 2, past the ball field, dark for the season, past Herrick and Low with one light still glowing in the cleaning crew's window. The Hartwell came up on the right, glowing like a struck match, gold light pouring from every window, valets jogging across the entrance. The Weber mechanical logo was projected 2 stories high onto the ballroom wall. And through the tall glass of the lobby, I saw him. In the tuxedo I'd picked up from the cleaners 100 times. Standing alone beside the fountain, checking his watch, adjusting his tie, arranging his face into that practiced smile, scanning the driveway for headlights. For me. The staff reporting for the last shift of her life. I want to be honest because you've come this far with me. I slowed down. 21 years of muscle memory reached for that turn signal like a hand reaching toward a hot pan. I'd been trained not to feel it anymore. And for 2 full seconds the entire settlement, the house, the legal fees, the clean, easy Christmas, sat in the passenger seat asking to be chosen. Then I drove past. Simple as that and hard as that. Past the valet. Past the gold light. Past the man rehearsing his marriage in a hotel lobby. The road went dark and quiet again, my heart hammering against my ribs, and I laughed. Alone in a $2,800 Corolla, wearing my good earrings, I laughed like a woman who had finally been let out of a building she hadn't realized was locked. At the next red light, I picked up my phone and typed the message I'd apparently been drafting without knowing it since that third brass hook in 2005. No. I'm done being proof that you're a good man. I hit send, set the phone face down on the seat, and drove back to Millbrook while the phone began to buzz and buzz and buzz. The cemetery gate stayed open until 9, and the groundskeeper who had known my mother had stopped pretending not to recognize my car. I parked on the gravel loop near her row and called Patricia, who, because I'd asked her that afternoon to stay near her phone, answered on the second ring. I'm not at the gala, I said. I know, she replied. It's 7:40, and my phone hasn't exploded. Talk to me. Draft it tonight, I said. He keeps the house, all the equity. I'm done fighting for it. In exchange, Emma's college fund gets locked for Emma, ironclad in the agreement. My retirement account stays mine. My name comes back, Putnam. And I want his signature within 2 weeks. Dissolution. No trial. Send it to Bricker in the morning. The line went quiet while she did the math she was paid to do. Laura, that's $60,000 of equity you're handing him. As your attorney, I need you to hear that number out loud. I looked through the windshield at the new headstone, pale against the darkness, the grass just beginning to knit over it. Ruth Putnam, 1957 to 2026. It's not 60,000, I said. It's a receipt. 21 years paid in full. And I never have to stand in a ballroom smiling for my life again. Send it. She was quiet for another second. Then she said something no one that expensive says lightly. It's been an honor, Mrs. She stopped herself. Ms. Putnam. The consent form arrived on my phone by email while I sat there. I signed it with my finger by the dome light, 12 feet from my mother's grave, the world's smallest and most expensive signature. Then I got out of the car and stood beside her grave in my navy dress in the October cold and told her the news out loud, because some conversations don't work silently. I finally quit, Mama. The wind moved through the oak branches. At 9:40, back in the car, my phone lit up with a text from Emma. Mom, are you seeing this? I wasn't at the gala, but everything in Millbrook eventually arrives the same way. Through somebody who was there, somebody who knew somebody who was there. And by Monday the town had assembled the evening like a quilt, every square signed. Here's what they saw. John alone at the company table. The empty chair beside him still wearing its little gold bow. John checking the lobby between courses. John on his third drink when the lights came down, and Gordon Weber, 66 years old, thanking the county for 60 years of trust before introducing the next general manager of Weber Mechanical. Ray Delgado, 15 years in the field, coach to half the town's little league teams, married to a nurse. The room stood for Ray. One man didn't. Then, at the coat check, while the band played its last set, my husband walked up to his retiring boss and demanded to know why. Some people said he grabbed Gordon by the lapel. Others disputed that detail. Nobody disputed the volume. After everything I gave this company. The music had just stopped between songs, and everyone heard him. Then Carol Weber stepped into that silence. She was wearing her good pearls, the same woman who had quilted beside my mother for 10 years, and she answered him in a voice witnesses described as gentle, which somehow made it worse. We heard what you gave, John. The whole cemetery heard it. Security escorted him through the glass doors, the same tall glass I had watched him through 3 hours earlier while he rehearsed his smile. Even the valet stand suddenly looked very busy. That was the end of his 11 years at Weber Mechanical, although the paperwork took another week to make it official. He had demanded to be put first, and the county had finally agreed on exactly where he stood. The settlement came back signed in 9 days. No counters, no theatrics. A man losing his job needs liquid cash more than leverage, and Bricker, whatever his volume settings, could read a room that was already on fire. Emma's college fund was locked for her. Untouchable, written into the agreement in language Patricia described as concrete with rebar in it. My retirement was mine. My name was mine again. The house and its $60,000 of equity went to him, a fact I have never regretted and never once called cheap. The Monday after the gala, Weber Mechanical and John Sutton parted ways, officially citing a company event and an email he'd sent Gordon at 1 in the morning that nobody has ever quoted directly, which in this town means it was ugly. Dolores closed the door. Her son had made the family ridiculous in front of the Webers, the pastor, the county, and everyone who mattered to her. And Dolores could forgive cruelty much faster than she could forgive spectacle. The Sunday dinners continued, I heard. But John's chair went the way of my apron hook. His sisters suddenly became very busy. The family photographs that Christmas had a gap in them like a pulled tooth. My father read the news of John's departure in the Millbrook Courier, folded the paper neatly in half, and gave me the final meaning of the sentence he'd spoken over my mother's grave. He wanted to matter more than everything. My dad set the paper down. Now he does. He's all he has left. That week, I put the green ledger in a box on the closet shelf. Its work was finished. Mine had 1 page left. The dissolution went through the week before Thanksgiving in a courtroom the size of a Sunday school classroom. 20 minutes. A few questions from the judge. Yes. John arrived in a suit that fit a man 10 pounds ago, and for the first time since the county fair 23 years earlier. He looked small. Really small. On the courthouse steps, beneath the first thin snow of the season, he stopped me. There was no audience left to perform for, just us, which by then was the only version of him I could stand. You've ruined me, he said. Not shouting. Almost asking. I looked at him and searched, honestly searched, for the anger everyone had assured me I would feel at that moment. Instead I found something quieter and much older. No, John, I said. I just stopped catering it. Then I walked down the steps to where my daughter was waiting in the Corolla with the heater running. I signed the last page that day as Laura Putnam, and my signature came out in careful round loops, the handwriting of a 21-year-old girl who'd been waiting inside that ledger all this time. And here's what I'll tell you about the drive home, because you've earned the whole truth. I grieved. You can grieve a marriage and still never wish it back. Want it back. Both things can be true at once, and nobody warns you about that. 21 years is 21 years, and I let myself be sad for all of them. Then my dad met us at the door. The porch light was on, the kitchen smelled like burned eggs, and somehow I was done being sad. One June later, almost exactly a year after I buried my mother. Here's where you'd find me on a Sunday. A rented duplex on Birch Street with a kitchen window that catches the afternoon light, a promotion to staff accountant, my own small stack of clients who bring me shoe boxes full of receipts like offerings, and a table, my table. Sunday dinner at my house runs on one law, posted nowhere but enforced always. Everybody carries their own plate. My dad brings a loaf of bread he baked himself. The fourth attempt was the first edible one, and he'd want you to know the count. Emma, home for the summer after her second year, brings a salad and her grandmother's laugh. Nobody wears an apron unless they feel like baking, and my mother's faded gingham apron hangs by the window in the good light. Some Saturdays I tie it on and make her apple pie, because an apron you choose is just soft armor for people who love butter. Last month, my dad showed up with a kitchen chair in the truck bed. It was my mother's chair from the old house, the one that used to sit at the head of their table. He carried it inside, set it at the head of mine and said, "Your mother saved you a seat." Across town I hear Dolores's Sundays go on. Same silver, same hooks. And now a nephew's young bride is learning which one is hers. The chain didn't break everywhere. Just doesn't run through me anymore. And it will never run through Emma, who, whenever anyone demands too much from anyone at my table, grins and delivers the family ruling. "We don't work here anymore." And James, because some of you have been wondering about James. My Emma teases me because I blush over breakroom coffee. For months, that's all it was. Coffee by the copier, spreadsheets, and his terrible jokes about depreciation. Then eventually, coffee on a Saturday at the diner on the square. Both of us arrived early. He's a widower. He knows what it costs to sit across from someone new. I'll tell you the moment I knew he was different. And it wasn't flowers. He asked me where I wanted to eat. Small, ordinary question. When I started to say, "Whatever's easiest," the way I'd said it for 21 years. He simply smiled and let the silence sit there, patient as a porch. He asked again what I wanted. Then he did something nobody had done for me in decades. He waited for my answer. "I'm in no hurry," he said, and neither is he. I was a whole woman before that man ever bought me a coffee, and he'd be the first to tell you so. That's the only kind of love I take now. The kind that waits. I still go to the cemetery on Sundays before dinner, carrying roses from my own little yard, and I sit on the grass beside my mother's pale headstone and give her the week's news, the way I used to on her porch. This June, 1 year out, I finally gave her the only report she ever actually wanted from me. I put someone first, Mama. Me. The oak moved overhead. The town hummed somewhere behind me. Casseroles were in transit, and the tables were full anyway. Dad, Emma, pie when I felt like making it. I sat down. "Mama, you'd like the chair." On the way out, I passed the groundskeeper, who tipped his cap, and I drove home with the windows down to a house where nobody was waiting to be served, and everybody was waiting for me. If there's one thing I'd carve over every kitchen door in this country, it's this. If love only counts when you're carrying the tray, it was never love. It was labor. And you are allowed to resign. That's my story. One phone call on a speaker. One quiet sentence from my father. And an apron I only wear when I choose to. If someone you love has spent years serving a table she's never been invited to sit at, share this story with her today. Drop a comment and tell me what you would have done at that graveside. I read every one. Hit subscribe if you haven't yet, and I'll see you in the next story.